Great. So I'm going to just hand over to Sunny, who is our moderator. AIRA Talks is a platform that brings together stakeholders that are interested in advancing digital rights on the continent, to share their experiences, to share their thoughts, to share their insights on specific topics. And today we're going to be speaking on the forthcoming or upcoming elections in South Africa and digital rights imperatives that we should all be thinking about as South Africans go to the polls. So join me to welcome Sunny Suleiman. Sunny.
Thank you very much, Adeboro, and hello to everyone, especially the fellow panelists and everyone else that find time to join this call. This is the second AIRA talk of the year. AIRA talks happened every quarter, and we have had for the first quarter, and we are this is our second AIRA talk. You can find previous AIRA talks on our website and YouTube channel, which will be pasted on the chat box. I also want to confirm and repeat what Adebora mentioned, that this session is being recorded. Also, we welcome and encourage your coverage of digital rights and our conversation today. Feel free to continue the conversation on our social media, on your social media handles, tagging AIRA. Also, if you have a follow-up questions or specific topics you would like to explore in more depth, please follow up with Adeboro, which is the AIRA coordinator, and Ashanut, the AIRA facilitator. The details will be posted in the chat again. One last thing before we, dive into the conversation, I would like to invite you to find and follow AIRA on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, or visit our website, aira.africa, and our YouTube channel on AIRA Digital Rights, AIRA, A-I-R-A, to learn more about our work and the Alliance as a whole. So our topic today is digital rights imperative in the 2024 South Africa elections. We have a set of panelists, which I will later introduce. But before then, I think we need to set a stage and kind of have a brief overview of what is the situation in South Africa is at the moment, and what we will be expecting in the next few days. So South Africa boasts of having one of the highest numbers of internet users on the continent and has, often topped the chart on indexes measuring internet freedom on the continent, such as Freedom on the Net Report 2023. As the country approaches a critical general election in 2024, however, existing inequalities and trends that concern digital rights emerge and must be addressed. Issues such as balancing freedom of expression against other fundamental freedoms, the practice of legislation on hate speech, tech platform accountability, and of course, potentially threatened civic space, which may have a direct impact on civic participation as the election comes up. This panel, like I said, brings experts working on digital rights and policy in South Africa and globally to discuss imperatives that stakeholders in South Africa must impose upon themselves if the upcoming elections will be free, fair, and truly democratic. The panel will discuss what roles each stakeholder has, in ensuring that digital rights are upheld and respected in the South Africa election? And if perhaps South Africa can model what digital democracy must be on the continent and in the global world. So I have with me four panelists from different background and organizations, and I'll be calling them one by one to introduce themselves and before we get into the conversation. So I will start with who do I have? Yes, Lindley Kumalu, to introduce herself to the audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sunny, and hi to everyone on the call. I'm very excited to be joining this discussion as a panelist. Yes, so my name is Slindile Khumalo. I'm an attorney of the High Court of South Africa, currently practicing in public interest litigation at a law firm called Power and Associates. I also work as a senior associate at Alt Advisory, which is a consultancy firm based in South Africa and has recently expanded to Kenya. And we're really just a group of technologists and lawyers and researchers looking at various digital rights questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lindley. Cheryl, over to you.
Thanks, Sunny. I'm Cheryl Das. I'm the Regional Director of the Legal Resources Center. I'm based in Cape Town. I'm a practicing lawyer. I've been practicing in the public interest NGO sector for the past 18 years. I currently head the Democratizing Big Tech program at the LRC, which is really focused on tech accountability. And I'm also the focal point for the Surveillance and Digital Rights Program in the International Network for Civil Liberty Organizations, which is a 15-member network comprising members from the global south and north. And then obviously the LRC is also part of the AIRA network, which we're very proud to be associated with. So thank you for having us on this in this session of the AIRA talks. Thank you, Sunny.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. And last but not the least, Bulanda.
Hi, Sunny. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Bulanda Nkowani, based out of Lusaka, Zambia, and I lead campaigns and partnerships at Digital Action. Digital Action is a friend of the AIRA network, and we essentially work at the intersection of tech and democracy. We're the current conveners of the Global Coalition for Tech Justice that is leading on the 2024 Year of Democracy campaign. And essentially what the coalition does is that it aims to challenge the global equity crisis at the center of tech accountability. We're also calling for increased investments and improved policies and safeguards by social media platforms. And specifically also for this 2024 election season, we're calling for fully resourced and equitable elections plans that are proportionate to risk and not market size. Again, thanks a lot for having me on this interesting conversation. Over to you, Sunny.
All right. Thank you so much for the introduction. So let's quickly dive into the conversation. Remember, we have 1 hour, 30 minutes for this conversation. I have a series of questions, that myself and the rest of the participants would like to get your insights on. So I'll be asking, we are going to spend most of the time conversing around those questions. However, there is additional 10 minutes for questions from the audience. So I will start with the Celine Lee to kind of get an overview and your insights for people that are not from South Africa. For example, myself, what is the current context if you could provide us with the current context for the South African election, to kind of set up the stage before we ask more specific questions to you and the rest of the panelists.
Sure, and thank you, Sunny. I think that's a very useful starting point to frame our discussion today. So the upcoming general election marks South Africa's 7th election since the country transitioned into a democratic dispensation in 1994. And several actors have described this election as a watershed moment for the country. This is mostly due to estimations that the current ruling party, the African National Congress, which has been in power since 1994, may lose, a significant degree of support this year. So, in order to just understand what the political climate is on social media, I would say that it largely reflects the reality offline as well. Broadly, South Africans are grappling with very high unemployment levels. Stats South Africa recently announced that the unemployment level sits at 45% amongst young people in the age bracket of 15 to 34 years old, and the national average sits at 32%. So South Africans are also grappling with load shedding, which are scheduled power cuts, the rising cost of living as elsewhere in the world, stark inequality, xenophobia, and questions about immigration policy and regulation, and high rates of violent crime. And recently, something that's been quite topical or in the news cycle is the news of the National Health Insurance Bill, which has been signed into law by the President, Cyril Ramaphosa. And this bill has kind of caused, divided public opinion. So while universal healthcare coverage is ideal for many people, there have been concerns about further squeezing or taxing an already small middle class relative to the size of South Africa's population. And in the context of international relations, I think it's fair to say that there have been mixed opinions about South Africa's response to events between Russia and Ukraine, and of course, more recently, the question of Palestine. What makes this particular election unique as well is the fact that independent candidates will be contesting for the first time. And Sunny, like you mentioned, from a digital rights perspective, South Africa has a fairly high internet connectivity rate and very high access to smartphone devices. So naturally, this raises questions about the role of tech companies and influencers, for example, in upholding the credibility of the information shared online during this time. So all in all, it's an important election with voters having to consider a plethora of issues. And yeah, given that we're only a few days away, I came across quite an interesting article earlier, which indicated that about a third of South African voters who were surveyed haven't yet made up their minds about who to vote for. So it's still very up in the air and there's lots to consider.
All right. Thank you so much, Lindley. This is a very wonderful overview, and thanks for highlighting some of the specific contents, including the landscape of digital rights in the country, and also the kind of political complexity that is present in South Africa. But also taken from what you just mentioned, I want to ask Cheryl maybe to give us some, let me say, more specific to the issue of digital rights. I want to know, what do you think are concerns regarding freedom of expression online in South Africa? What should we expect from this election and all of that? Cheryl?
Thanks, Sonny. I think I should, set the scene a little bit. I think we should start by saying that unlike countries like the United States, freedom of expression is not an absolute right. The South African Constitution, Section 16 to be specific, guarantees everybody the right to freedom of expression, and which includes the freedom of press and media, freedom to receive and impart information or ideas, artistic and creative expression, and academic and scientific freedoms. But these rights, however, are limited to the extent that it does not extend to propaganda for war or incitement of imminent violence or the advocacy of hatred on any protected grounds such as race, ethnicity, gender, or religion, which also constitutes incitements to cause harms. So our laws protect Jews and Palestinians equally, if I can put it that way. The inclusion of this limitation was included thoughtfully and intentionally by the drafters of our Constitution to protect at-risk groups. And it also should be understood against the backdrop of historical atrocities and dehumanizing narratives that the apartheid government committed and propagated against Black and brown people in South Africa. So this limitation sought to eradicate the use of dehumanizing, hateful narratives and incitement to violence against any group on the basis of these protected grounds. So freedom of expression rights also under the Constitution should be read with our equality and non-discrimination clause. So our laws are clear on freedom of expression and its limitations. And I would argue that this would apply equally to online and offline speech. One of the major concerns around online speech is the virility and the reach of online speech that is harmful and which amounts to hate speech or incitement to violence. So while our laws give recourse to those affected by such speech, the harm is already done and is spread far and wide. You can't really restore someone's dignity and reputation, and in some cases their lives, when online calls for violence results in offline harm. So the danger of online speech or freedom of speech that actually violates our hate speech laws is particularly dangerous. The second concern is that the safety of perpetrators, the safety of perpetrators enjoy under the anonymity of their online accounts. It is difficult to hold them accountable for breaching our hate speech laws. So where a perpetrator of hate speech or persons inciting violence against a particular group based on protected grounds, the law is clear and such speech is impermissible. And an aggrieved person has recourse, for example, to our equality courts for a range of orders, which is not merely limited to compensatory awards. But where a perpetrator hides behind the anonymity of their social media accounts, for example, there is little or no recourse. And tech corporations who provide the platforms for the spread of online hate and incitements to violence, as well as disinformation, take no responsibility or accountability for the spread and dissemination of hate and incitements to violence. And we haven't yet tested whether we can hold them equally accountable for the violations of hate speech laws. So when it comes to online perpetrators or online speech that amounts to hate speech, there is a cloak of anonymity of the perpetrators, and there's an enabling of their behavior through the design of social media platforms particularly. And this is where we stand, and it's equally applicable to, currently in how election campaigning has been happening. So that is a real concern, I think, for us.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Thanks for laying the ground, around the policy and regulatory landscape in South Africa, and also you kind of touched on the issue of platform accountability, regulation of harm speech and what have you. I think this is where we bring in Bulanda, given your work around platform accountability, and also the role of tech platforms in terms of, keeping the space sane, if I may use the word, and all of that. So I would like to ask a question. How do you think, maybe from the engagements that you have had with this company, and also, the, previous elections that happened in the continent and elsewhere, how do you think these tech platforms should be preparing for the 2024 South Africa elections?
Okay, thanks a lot, Sunny. It's a very important question for us to be asking. I just hope it's not too late for us to be asking that question now, considering that the election is just a few days away, and the platforms by now should have put in place all of the necessary measures and guardrails. So we can only hope that they've done that. And I use the word hope because they haven't been as transparent as they should be about some of their plans and measures for this, a lot of the elections, but also in particular for this election, and how they plan to safeguard people. So I think the first aspect that we really, are speaking to is that of them providing fully and equitably resourced elections plans that are proportionate to risk of harm presented by South Africa and not necessarily market size. So in the South African case, I've seen plans by Meta, I've seen plans by TikTok. One of the few plans, elections plans that we've seen within the African market, or within the African continent, out of all the elections that are happening this year. And I'm more inclined to think that South Africa, or the platforms, have elections planned for South Africa because it's a big market, not necessarily based on the risk of harm. So we're calling that platforms should provide these elections plans, not based on market size, but on risk of harm. So well and good, they've provided plans for South Africa, but what about other countries that are going to the polls this year? So far we have, for example, South Sudan, Mozambique, where there are some tensions that are brewing, and any act of negligence could lead or spark chaos. So typically platforms will set up, for example, election centers. They will, have the appropriate team within that to address that particular election, and of course they'll cover out election plans. But our recommendation really is that, for example, 6 months before the election, let them conduct, systematic risk assessments of each election, and use these findings to inform their election plans. At the same time, it means liaising with local structures, so the local EMBs, the civil society, media, and so on and so forth, are key to informing these elections plans. And we've seen, again, a lot of those collaborations between some of the platforms and the local structures. Ideally, elections plans, should stipulate the plans that the platform has to stamp out disinformation, for example, some of the response mechanisms and mitigation strategies, issues around how will they collaborate with local stakeholders, and any adjustments, for example, that they need to make, either their policies or their algorithms. We find that a lot of the plans that we've assessed for this particular election, most of them point to media literacy. They point to media literacy really as an avenue for addressing disinformation and some of these online harms. So it's really pointing to user empowerment, burdening the media, again, with media literacy, but also shifting the responsibility. So it's to say, okay, the media users, do your work, and not so much taking responsibilities as platforms. Also, the current plans, you find that they, well and good, they've seeded local partnerships with local fact checkers, the local election management body, that's the IEC, and Media Monitoring Africa, Africa Check. We can see that collaborating around fact checking. And they also go on to state some of the languages where they would be doing content moderation for this specific election. So content moderation and fact checking. But again, you find that these plans are not concrete. Because it's more firefight, all the approaches are more firefighting, reactive approach, when we all know that the real issue really is around, platform recommender systems based on engagement ranking. And that's what we should all be working to fix. So these plans not being concrete, again, they're not very different from what was presented in previous elections. And if you have had a chance to go through them, it's really speaking to what they plan to do and not the how part. So yes, granted, you've told us what you plan to do, but how do you plan to do that? So in essence, it's, for example, just, pointing out, we're going to have this number of content moderators in South Africa, and a specific number addressing such and such a language, or, which number of content moderators is assigned to which language, that sort of thing, rather than just saying, for example, we have the largest fact-checking network compared to the other platforms, but at least go on to speak about some of the fact-checking mechanisms that you have put in place and some of the collaborations that you have with the people on ground. And if there are any concrete changes to, for example, there are policies around elections, picking any algorithm, even just simple things like general description of the algorithms that they plan to use. So really, we're calling for more transparency in this area. Let them name some of the tools that they're deploying, for example, for automated content moderation. Are they planning to activate any tools, for emergency situation? So it's, again, we're calling for more transparency around what exactly is contained in these elections plans and elections operations. Other than that, I'm sure we'll speak to this much later on. There's, with the lack of transparency around these plans, the LRC went ahead and sent an information request to the platform to understand more what was contained within these elections plans. But of course, that was not upheld because the platform said that they were not bound by South African access to information laws, which was really, really unfortunate. The second thing that the platform should be doing within the South African election is to ensure trustworthiness and information plurality during this election. So we're seeing a lot of working relationships with local trusted partner networks, the election management body, civil society, fact checkers, that they're working around verification of information, fact checking, and of course they're providing that local context. And all three companies were meant to sign a voluntary framework of cooperation to address information in this election. And they've also gone ahead, so that's the IEC, election management body, and some partners, civil society partners, for example, like Media Monitoring Africa, they've gone ahead to collaborate on different measures, including a platform known as 411 for reporting disinformation. But we find that Twitter, I believe, hasn't signed this voluntary framework of cooperation. Again, I'll probably point to all of the changes that are happening within the company, and they have not been as engaged as they should be, not just in this election, but in a lot of the elections, but also just in a lot of the accountability conversations, they have not been as engaged. But also the layoffs are worrying because now they have a limited staff component to deal with any issues around electoral integrity. But also Elon had promised that Twitter, X rather, would be a space for free speech. So perhaps that's their strategy, to just stay away from engaging people and all of these conversations. That is their strategy, who knows? But also we see that aside from working with the stakeholders that I've mentioned, we also have this African Editors Forum that had also attempted to reach out to the platforms around having some sort of joint action to combat disinformation, and in particular, hate speech that may affect journalists within this period. They also complained that the platforms have been unresponsive to them. Again, in continuing on, how platforms should provide trustworthy of information, they should also ensure that recommender systems promote and amplify authoritative voices. So, like the voices of the Electoral Commission, for example. The other recommendation is that platforms should counter the reach and effects of disinformation and online gender-based violence. Again, LRC did an investigation where Some journalists were subjected to online gender-based violence, and of course, we've seen some incidents of disinformation. But again, the recommendation is that they should be engaging in effective and timely content moderation. That's of course rooted in international human rights standards. I spoke about numbers, determining the number of human content moderators, for the large South African population. Also looking at the language coverage to ensure that there's cultural competency. But also it's the aspect of enhancing cross-platform collaboration. As you know, there are times where a piece of disinformation will emanate from one platform and then it spreads to the other platform. So it's just about the platforms collaborating closely to stamp out disinformation that is cross-posted. Also, establishment of proper oversight and transparency. Again, this is very cross-cutting. So aside from platforms publicly listing their terms of service and policies around the elections, it's really to provide regular updates if there are any changes within those policies. It could be issues around recommender operations, content moderation systems, even modalities for cooperation with trusted flaggers, because already we've seen issues, like I mentioned, where a group of the editors forum feel disgruntled that the platforms have been unresponsive when they had reached out to see if they could work together. Again, platforms should ensure that there's transparency in political advertising. So, for example, being able to label such content, being able to filter politically charged ads that are not allowed under the current electoral law. But also giving users power to opt out of such advertising, giving access to ad libraries. We all get a better sense of who's advertising on these platforms, and that we're able to, to give better scrutiny of campaign finance and spending. Also, it's to make data available for researchers. We're winding up. It's to make data available for researchers. So currently, again, there's a big call around this.
I'm sorry.
And as you know, yes, Sunny. To make data available for researchers. Okay, I'm getting some feedback, but I'll just proceed. As you know, research is key for all of us to understand the effects of social media and online harms, but also very key in framing some of their policies and some of the protocols, even as they plan to combat online threats and online harms. And lastly, it's to combat the deceptive use of AI or generative AI. So we have not seen a lot of incidents where generative AI or deepfakes have been used in the electoral context on the continent. A few cases have begun to emerge, and one case that I can point to in South Africa's cases where former President Zuma's daughter shared a deepfake video of Donald Trump endorsing one of the candidates. So really, we're asking that the platforms must actively work to identify some of these potential risks of generative AI content and its use in elections ahead of the election, come up with the concrete guidelines, but also working, for example, to flag and label this content. Currently, there's a requirement for content creators to again, divulge information if they have used, if, for example, that particular content that they have created contains any synthetic media, for example. But we're also asking that platforms should also actively work to flag, label this content, and conduct the necessary risk assessment within the electoral context. Again, very, very for this election and overall, I think if you look at the African population, where there's a high degree of social and economic inequality, and any algorithmic bias can exacerbate existing disparities and undermine social cohesion. So those are the few recommendations. Again, just to reiterate that a lot of these recommendations are recommendations or measures that should be put in place months in advance of the election. Because, electoral period is in many phases, as the pre, the during, and the post. So we can only hope that the platforms will do the needful, and that a lot of these measures that we're recommending are actually embedded in their election plans. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Belanda. This is a lot to unpack, obviously, and thanks for highlighting the effort of the independent fact checkers, in the wake of all of this um, accountability issues that are happening in South Africa. I would like to have a follow-up question on whether we have, you can pinpoint some specific concrete activities that you will say, yes, these platforms are doing something. However, maybe you made mention also of the issue of lack of transparency, from the platforms themselves, and also you kind of touched on uh, the the kind of socio-political situation and in the country. So I'm coming back to that question of transparency, and also maybe if you can highlight some of the concrete examples that we can see as these platforms, especially from the social media platforms, not the independent fact checkers. Now I will go to I would like to call on Lindile to there is a recent principles and guidelines for the use of digital and social media in elections in Africa, which is developed by the Association of African Election Authorities. So what do you think, um, how best can the South African authorities best incorporate those principles in the upcoming general election?
Thanks so much for the question, Sunny. Yes, you're right that the principles and guidelines were developed by the Association of African Electoral Authorities, which is essentially a group of different heads of electoral management bodies who convene and dialogue and exchange ideas about the broad election or the management of elections, rather. And as far as I understand it, they are located across the region, and the secretariat is based in Ghana. So the principles and guidelines were launched in February this year, and although they are non-binding in nature, they really do provide a useful guideline to election management bodies and other stakeholders in navigating the digital rights landscape and some of the common challenges which arise during elections season online, such as mis and disinformation, hate speech online, disruptions to the internet and telecommunications infrastructure, attacks on members of the media, just to name a few. And the principles and guidelines are based or are rooted in rather various international and regional law human rights laws, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. And just to give an overview, there are 4 interrelated objectives which are tied to the principles and guidelines. Firstly, they aim to contribute to the integrity of electoral processes in the region. Secondly, they aim to foster policy development regarding social media usage and management during elections. Third, the guidelines are envisaged to serve as a resource to social media platforms and help them inform their own internal policies. And lastly, they seek to inform electoral regulatory processes in a way which aligns with the normative human rights framework. And what the Association of African Electoral Authorities has done is to affirm the specific rights that must be protected during elections for the entirety of the cycle, and then categorize, specific guidelines and recommendations speaking specifically to different groups or different actors. And these groups include the state, electoral management bodies, social media platforms, regulatory bodies, political parties themselves, and sort of candidates, traditional institutions and religious bodies, civil society organizations, of course, journalists and the media at large, and then digital intermediaries. And the partners who worked on the guidelines include the African Union Commission, the United Nations Development Programme, and UNESCO. And at this stage, they've endorsed, they've received endorsements from a couple of election management bodies. Interestingly, South Africa's Deputy President, Paul Mashadile, has endorsed the principles and guidelines and has urged other countries to do the same. With respect to the second part of your question about how these principles and guidelines can be incorporated by South African authorities, I think firstly, it's useful that they are drafted in such clear terms and are fairly accessible in the language that they use. So that's just credit to those involved in developing the principles and guidelines. But the first port of call, in my view, would be spreading awareness about the existence of these principles and guidelines, obviously not just for this election, given that it's around the corner, but for future electoral cycles. And then more broadly, just building on existing efforts to conscientize internet users about what digital rights are, and different avenues for recourse where they have suffered some form of online harm. It's might be necessary to particularly target those who are most vulnerable to experience online harms. And I don't see this as sort of a journey that has a destination. I think it's ongoing and must be continuous, given just emerging forms of harm, as well as developments in technology. Bulanda mentioned, generative AI, which is obviously rapidly changing. So it's important that this is sort of an ongoing process before, during, and after elections. Thanks, Sunny.
Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, I think Sunny, can you still hear us?
Yes,
right.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Selindile. Thanks for the great overview, and you highlight the principles in such a detailed manner. Thank you for that. And also I love the fact that you mentioned that the South African government has kind of ratified this, which is great. We should be, expecting some sort of compliance to this non-binding instrument. So I'll be going to Cheryl to ask a question, around the recent judicial decisions. Recently, there are some judicial decisions that tell us about the, jurisprudential evolution of the freedom of expression online in South Africa. I would like to, first to tell us some of these decisions, and also how do you think they kind of going to affect this upcoming election?
Thanks, Sunny. I think I mentioned earlier on about the foundations of how these judicial decisions have come across, particularly around our Equality Act and our prohibition against hate speech and the limitations on freedom of expressions. So over the years, there have actually been notable judgments against political parties and some right-wing social movements on whether their form of expression, including campaigning online and offline, is protected under the freedom of expression provision or is limited as hate speech or incitement to violence. So many of these cases that were brought before the equality courts were directly against politicians who have publicly or online violated our hate speech provisions. And I think some of the notable cases, there's quite a few, but the notable cases was the AfriForum case, for instance, which involved whether or not displaying the old South African flag, which many viewed as a symbol of apartheid and white supremacy, amounted to hate speech. And in that decision, the court said, yes, it did. Another interesting case this time involved the economic freedom fighters. They are the third largest opposition party in South Africa. And they were hauled before the Equality Court around the singing of struggle songs, which, when translated, use the words "kill the Boer." And here, interestingly enough, the court had to strike a balance between freedom of expression with the prohibition against hate speech. And the courts in this case found that the song, when interpreted within the context in which it was sung, so the song was, and maybe just to understand South African political culture, at most political rallies, comrades are either singing as they come into a rally, singing during the rally, and singing after the rally. It's a sound to action. It's a sound to fall. It's about remembering. It's about remembering the struggle against apartheid, and so the court found that singing that song, even though it called for, kill the Boer in that context, it didn't literally mean kill farmers. Within that context, it did not amount to hate speech. So that was a very, very interesting case where the courts interpreted what that balance is between freedom of speech and our prohibition against hate speech. So, and there's various other cases that I can mention. I mean, there were instances where, for example, in the past, prominent figures like the Zulu King had called for the killing of migrants in South Africa. There's been a very well-known journalist who had written an article, a very defamatory article and a very hateful argument targeting the LGBTI community in South Africa. And in most instances, those cases have sort of widened the interpretation of freedom of expression versus hate speech. And in most cases where someone has been attacked, particularly because they belong to a particular community and for essentially the characteristics of that community, like the LGBTI community, like the migrant community, or on the basis of their race or nationality or ethnicity, the courts have said that speech amounts to hate speech and is not protected under the freedom of expression provision. So while these judgments clarify the boundaries in which political parties should operate, particularly during election campaigning online and offline, this has not really been a deterrent. The Independent Electoral Commission, for example, has a code of conduct for political parties that prohibits hate speech and incitements to violence. And that should also serve as a deterrent. So, for example, the code prohibits parties from using language that provokes violence or from publishing false information about other candidates or parties. But online expression is extremely hard to contain, and the political gains of manipulating voters and swaying political discourse far outweighs the penalties for non-compliance of these codes. Another consideration is that political parties, and we've seen this recently on social media, political parties have been able to indirectly spread hate speech and election disinformation through surrogate or influencer accounts. So accounts that don't claim to be held by political parties, but they are supporters of political parties. And they're the ones that are doing the bidding on behalf of political parties. And there's no obligation on them to disclose their funding. There's no obligation on them to disclose that their political affiliation, for etc. And so this shields them, the political parties and campaigners, from scrutiny, while still spreading harmful, divisive, and violent content online that benefit those political parties. So online speech and election disinformation is far more difficult to curtail. And with tech corporations having little to no accountability, at least in the South African context, it is virtually impossible to enforce constitutionally protected rights against online speech that amounts to hate speech and incitement to violence. And there hasn't been a specific case, not yet anyway, that either has taken this as an issue around online speech. And again, it's really because not enough has been, there's not enough research into the links and the ties between these influencer and surrogacy accounts and political parties. So on the face of it, political parties and political advertising, there are labels to suggest that they are paid for the political party. But what we don't know is all of these indirect transgressors that are pumping, sort of bolstering those kind of messaging through social media in support of these political parties. And I think that's an avenue where it will be a good avenue to test through our courts, and whether we're able to get redress, not just against the perpetrators, the political parties and the offenders, but also the tech corporations, again, that permit such behavior. Thanks for the question, Sunny.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. This is quite relatable. We have seen this pattern whereby, so many political parties are finding a way to some sort of bypass the laws or twist the laws to their whims. And South Africa, obviously, from your remarks, is not different, which raises more concerns, obviously, on the upcoming election, whether the judicial system is ready to handle such activities that we are more likely going to see. I have more questions. However, we do not have time. I earlier mentioned that we allocated 1 hour 30 minutes for this call, but we will have to cut that to an hour or something around that. So I will open the floor for questions from the audience. But before I do that, I'll come back to the panelists, Lindley, Cheryl, and Bolanda, for their last remarks. And that last remark, I'm going to ask if, for example, if you had to speak to one stakeholder, just one stakeholder in the coming election, what would you say to them in order to uphold digital rights and democratic integrity? But before that, I will open the floor for questions from the participants. So if you have a question, please use the raise hand button, or you can simply unmute yourself and talk. You can also use the chat bot to drop your comments, feedback, and insights. So is there anybody who would like to ask your question at this point? Okay, if we have questions, I do have a question. Again, let me use the time that I have allocated for the questions to ask Bulanda. Going back to the issue of transparency, we also had Cheryl mention, there is a little transparency from these companies and all of that. And you earlier also mentioned the issue of the generative AI. Celindile also mentioned the risk posed by the generative AIs in terms of elections. So, Belinda, how do you think these tech platforms can, ensure better transparency and also provide better mechanisms around privacy in the use of AI tools for the issue of political micro-targeting? We have heard from Cheryl how the political parties are twisting the laws to um to for this micro-targeting activities and also advertising, also abuse of freedom of expression and all of that. So what do you think need to this platform need to do in terms of transparency and privacy? Sorry.
Okay, thanks, Sunny. So quite difficult to secure transparency, especially around issues of privacy and the use of AI tools for political micro-targeting or advertising. As you know, advertising, micro-targeting are the money makers for the platforms. But really, it's just perhaps ensuring that we get the platforms to be a bit more transparent on where they are using, for example, AI tools, and ensuring that these meet the ethical standards, especially around privacy. But it's also for them transparent and accountable if, for example, they're giving access platform data that involves user information, user data, and if it speaks to like electoral preferences of users. I think that's data that they should not be availing, for example, to third parties. And ideally, in the South African scenario, I would say that this is where the data protection framework should, and be used, or rather be applicable within this context to ensure that there's no manipulation by the ad companies. So ideally, again, data protection office should work with the election management body to set standards and protections around privacy, ensure that they are, addressing any privacy issues that may emerge, any privacy abuses by the political parties themselves in using user data in their campaigns, but also other advertisers, from targeting users with certain campaign-based messaging. Again, ironically, we saw in the case of the access to information law where the platform said that they were not bound by local laws. So it'd be interesting to see if the data protection framework or legislation within South Africa would then be applicable to them in this instance. Again, I think one of the things that perhaps we need to interrogate is, the modalities of the platform's registrations in our countries. Because I believe for you to set up office, set up camp in a country, you need to be registered and you need to abide by the laws of the land. So it'd be interesting to interrogate some of the modalities of their registrations and to see what sort of laws apply to them and where they could be held liable. So yeah, that would be my take on it. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Yolanda. So since you still have the mic, your concluding remark, for example, if you are to, you get a chance to speak to any of the, okay, not any, just one stakeholder in the coming elections, what would you say to them in order to uphold digital rights and democratic integrity?
Okay, I would definitely be speaking to the platforms. So I read an interesting report the other day that says that users are increasingly turning to online platforms as their main source of information. It's a very dangerous thing. That should not be the case. Unfortunately, it is the case. So really, it's just to say that when we look at our African context, our elections have historically been marked by uncertainty and instability. And social media has only exacerbated these dynamics. So really, we are asking for platforms to recognize that increasingly important role that they are playing within our societies, the role that they are playing just in shaping discussions, shaping conversations and society a whole, even the potential implications that this would have on the democratic fabric. So really, we're asking that the platform should be transparent, be accountable, and assume that greater responsibility in contributing to safeguarding people and democracy. While we recognize it should be a multifaceted approach, but we're asking the platforms as the providers of these social media tools to be in the forefront and assume greater responsibility. So yeah, to the platforms, please play your part to safeguard people and democracy. Please act equitably to put in place all the break glass measures for all of us. So regardless of the region, we all want the same elections plans, the same more or less similar policies and break glass measures, regardless of the market size or the number of subscribers that we have on your platforms. Other than that, it's just to wish Cheryl, Slindile, and everybody else in South Africa a good election. And again, wishing all of us a happy Africa Day tomorrow. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you so much, Ulanda. So accountability and transparency. Thank you for that. Yeah, you tagged Celine already, so I'm going to ask her to if just one stakeholder, what are you going to talk?
Thank you for the question. My answer is somewhat related to Bolanda's answer. So, yeah, this is a recurring theme before every election, but I would target young voters who are maybe considering not voting this year. I completely understand how easy it is to become sort of overcome by apathy given political and economic difficulties. But I think, voting is obviously a privilege and such an important part of being an active citizen. And we're witnessing currently such powerful resistant movements across the world towards several issues, and a number of them are led by young people. So maybe just to young voters to not underestimate their power. And while social media is, a very useful tool to ventilate key issues that we're faced with on a daily basis, it's important to not maybe become disillusioned by it and the views that are spread there. And just remember that the power ultimately is exercised by you casting your vote. So maybe don't rely, or overly rely rather, on social media as a primary means of information. Read far and wide, engage with different perspectives to inform your vote, and potentially become a supporting mechanism for others who are grappling with whether or not to vote this year. That would be my message.
Thank you so much. So that will be responsible participation in the voting process, as well as, responsible use of the social media. So thank you very much for that. And now to Cheryl.
Thanks, Sunny. I think I'm going to echo Bolanda, and I would like to have a sit down with big tech corporations, particularly because, as Bolanda said, they've been ghosting us for a while. But I want to say this as my parting message: the foundations of free and fair elections are premised on honesty and not illusion. And where there is a possibility of the distortion of the truth, that can never be good for democracy and is definitely not conducive to a free and fair election. In the context of elections, there is a difference between persuasion and manipulation. Persuasion has been a tactic that's been used by political parties to win over the electoral, and it is permissible for decades. But manipulation should never be permissible. And with the advancement of digital technologies, manipulation as opposed to persuasion has become the norm. And we should consider this a very, very serious threat to the integrity of democracy and elections. So if I had this sit down with big tech corporations, I would definitely, in a nutshell, tell them to do better, to make their platforms safer, free from political manipulation, divisive content, and commit to a safety by design model. that is conducive to promoting democracy and the integrity of elections. So, in the words of Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. And I thank you again for having me on this panel. And like Belinda said, I wish everybody a happy Africa Day. And we're crossing fingers that our elections will be safe and free of that manipulation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. So safety will be the central focus of your last remark. And also, I love the fact that you make that distinction between persuasion and manipulation. So thank you. So we are giving back 19 minutes. Like I said, we have lots of questions, but we will have to limit the conversation to 1 hour. But so far so good. It has been a very wonderful conversation. Different perspectives, different insights from our moderators, Cheryl Das, Slindile Kumalu, and Blanda Onkwani. Thank you so much to the and the all attending. Like I said, you can learn more about AIRA on our Facebook and link. And I say Happy Africa Day. Obviously, we wish South Africa election. So at this point, I will have to put a full stop here. I wish everyone a good day and South African a happy ending. Thank you. Well, happy ending to the elections, obviously.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sunny.
Thanks.